Hi, welcome to FedScoop TV. I'm Billy Mitchell, and today I'm here with Ted Okada, the CTO of FEMA. We're at the Red Hat Government Symposium, talking a little bit about all things open source. Ted, thanks for joining us today.
Yes. Thanks for being
here. Open source is a concept a lot of people talk about, but
Yep.
we kind of want to jump into how it's kind of helping with the big topic of IT modernization currently. Yep. And so, easy question, what do you see as the benefits that open source is providing agencies right now in that push to IT modernization?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So this idea of open source, there's a lot of sort of cultural things attached to that, which is, good governance, effectively, right? So this idea of openness, transparency, open data. There's a lot of sort of underlying sort of philosophical concepts around open source. But practically speaking, open source allows for what I consider an attenuation of volatility in a lot of the infrastructure. An organization like FEMA requires us to be not only measurable and manageable in the work that we do, and not only repeatable. We've just had 4 major catastrophic disasters,
Sure.
Harvey, Irma, Maria, and the California fires, which has really stretched not just FEMA, but the entire federal government in terms of its response recovery and how we're going to mitigate long-term a lot of these hazards that might affect these states and territories and Commonwealth. So one of the challenges is, I'll often add that it's not just measurable, manageable, but how do we become repeatable, sustainable, and scalable? So this idea of how can we actually scale and sustain that level of effort? So it really requires an infrastructure that is very stable. So it doesn't mean that you can't be creative or generate new applications, for example. But the idea is, how do we quickly scale what we are doing to meet the need of 4 catastrophic disasters in the case of 2017. So this idea of increasingly coming up with an infrastructure that a community owns. I often like to say, it's always the insight of the experts, the power of algorithms, and the wisdom of the crowd. So in other words, when you have open source projects that are owned not by proprietary consulting companies, but by a very large developer community, you're going to find that kind of infrastructure tending to be more stable and less volatile in the long term. And we can effectively allow FEMA to stand as an agency on sort of solid ground as we build that capability to repeat the work we're doing over multiple disasters, to sustain it for a long time, and then ultimately to scale it when we've got to add thousands of folks to join in our large stakeholder community that's now deployed over this large disaster field.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then looking forward to the future with things like emerging technologies and all these innovative technologies that people are kind of buzzing about. How does open source play a role in that?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that if you look at the largest, most successful software companies out there, Google, Amazon, Facebook, even Microsoft to a certain extent, to a large extent now actually with their cloud computing, and those companies, they've all built their infrastructure on open source software. Certainly in the case of a large company like Google. So effectively what we've done at FEMA is to take those best practices in terms of what is rapidly being acknowledged as this sort of high-speed agile software development. And the use of this technique called developer operations. And so, but effectively what it is just high-speed release of new capabilities and accelerating the authorization of those systems to be high speed instead of months or days. You're doing it within hours. And so that ability is what we're sort of taking advantage of. And quite frankly, it's the open source movement as expressed in consortiums like the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, which give us a kind of stable foundation to build our solutions on.
Ted, we hear a lot about containers and containerization
Yep.
and when it comes to open source, and I'd love to hear how you guys at FEMA are kind of leveraging that to innovate within your agency.
All right, so containers are a large part of that because the idea is that every developer should work in this container. It's effectively a small version of an operating system, right? And then be able to check in code and deploy code. That code then becomes, in order to get that authorization to operate, there's a process by which it goes through a process by which we, look at any security vulnerabilities and do it very quickly. And so this notion of automating that is the emerging standard. And standards of automation is effectively what is going to get us to that, because the metric really in terms of attenuating risk is the perception or the reality of time. So the quicker we can automate that authorization process and then have product managers then scale infrastructure, for example, or aggregate complex pieces of that product as a product manager into a coherent solution, that's effectively what this sort of emerging standardized open source container sort of universe is kind of affording us right now. So we're excited to actually to really dive into this right now as an agency.
And then we can't have any IT conversation without mentioning cybersecurity.
Right.
Maybe talk a little bit about cybersecurity and open source, and then kind of how industry can play a role in that.
Yeah, so there's a guy Eric Raymond. I was just thinking about his paper he wrote in 1997. It's called "The Cathedral and the Bazaar," and he's famous for saying, with a million eyeballs, all bugs are shallow. Mm-hmm. So in other words, look, secure code is good code. So when you think of things that are cyber vulnerabilities, things like memory overflows and things like that, those things are usually a result of poor software and poor software design. So in effect, good software is actually secure software, and there are ways of attenuating that risk. And of course, cybersecurity is a much more complex than just simply software, right? It's system design and system engineering. I think one of the things that we're kind of coming back to is this idea of system thinking and looking at infrastructure as part of that system, and then even looking at how we design software or facilitate design of software as part of that system. If we do that, then cybersecurity is a normal process. I think this idea that cybersecurity is somewhat separate, or bifurcated from the rest of software design is bad thinking, of course, right? So it is really going back to, I think, the roots of computer science, going back 30, 40 years ago in terms of system administration and system thinking, letting systems secure themselves and letting the system be secure. So then in the end, if we're building a solution, the software developer simply needs to just deploy code, write code, and through the process of automation, continuous integration, continuous deployment, you're able to actually get both good software, secure software, and solutions out the door faster. So that's really sort of the promise of where open source and container thinking and DevOps is really driving us to.
Great. Yeah. Ted, thanks so much for joining us. I'm Billy Mitchell of FedScoop TV. For more of our videos, visit us at fedscoop.com. Thanks for watching.